Let's talk about Eddington, which is a new Ari Aster film, and honestly, one of the most divisive films we've seen all year. You either love it, you hate it. I don't think you can fall in the middle of this one. You're just either going to love or hate it. And that's exactly what I want from a film. I want a film that is not going to try to please everybody. And I think we've gotten so many of those in the past couple of years that it's very refreshing to see a filmmaker just be like, you know what, this is what I think and this is what I'm going to present to you. Because as I always say, a film is a piece of art and it is the artist's feelings, whatever he thinks, right? So Ari Aster, kudos to you. But let's talk about this movie and its themes and everything about it. We'll quickly go through what happens in this movie, and I won't take much time in talking about it because I feel like I should just go really quickly to get right into the themes. Let's not make this video too long, right? So this movie takes place in May of 2020 as we see the COVID pandemic just barely coming to America, right? And we are in the town of Eddington, New Mexico, where we have the mayor, Ted Garcia, running for re-election, who is played by Pedro Pascal. And we also have the sheriff of the town, Joe Cross, played by Joaquin Phoenix, who doesn't like lockdowns, doesn't like mask mandates, and believes they can do a better job and not violate people's freedom, just as Ted Garcia has done. So you have these mayor standoff happening where we're going to see it collide into such an epic conclusion here. You also have Emma Stone here as Louise Cross, who is the wife of Joe Cross, and Louise is sort of falling for conspiracies. Her mother, Dawn, is living with both her and Joe now due to the pandemic, and her mother is always attaching herself to all of these different conspiracies and feeding them to Louise, which causes her to spiral even more. One of the things to note is that there is a history with Ted Garcia and Louise in the past that Joe knows about, and also Dawn, and this comes to play later on. You have Micheal Ward, who is seemingly one of the only POCs in this film. He is a black sheriff trainee, and he works for Joe Cross and is helping him with his campaign against Ted Garcia as well. You also have Austin Butler here, who is playing Vernon, who is a cult leader that Louise is very attached to and really wanting to be a part of his whole ideas. Luke Grimes here plays Guy, who is another officer at Eddington, and now you have this sort of powder keg that's about to go throughout this film. So throughout the whole entirety of the film, we see as Ari Aster pokes at things from the pandemic, whether it was the mask mandates or how people acted towards one another, how they had never acted with one another before, but now the pandemic sort of accelerated those feelings even more. We even see that the Black Lives Matter protests eventually come to Eddington due to the murder of George Floyd, and that's when things really start to kick into high gear because Joe Cross is also sort of implied to have done police brutality on a homeless man that we see throughout the whole film, and we all know has COVID and is spreading it around, and he's just another ticking time bomb because eventually we see that Joe Cross is backed against the wall during his mayoral campaign. He can't seemingly beat Ted Garcia, so he decides to go for a low blow and decides to say, you know what, Ted Garcia raped my wife Louise when she was younger, and that's who he is. He's a rapist. Eventually Louise finds out about this because it was broadcasted on video, and she decides to leave with Vernon, and she discloses in a video of herself that it was not Ted Garcia who did this, and it's sort of implied throughout the movie it was possibly her late father who actually did something horrible to her. This makes Joe completely spiral, and he decides to take it out on everybody. First, he goes to a noise complaint that is happening at Ted Garcia's house, and this is a gathering that Ted Garcia has now had. And you sort of see the hypocrisy from Ted Garcia, who throughout the film talks about no gathering, about having mask mandates, social distancing, and things like that. But at his party, seemingly people are breaking the rules and nobody's really saying anything. Joe Cross comes here to try to turn on the music, and this causes Ted Garcia to slap him continuously, which is just a breaking point finally as Joe goes to kill the vagrant man in the bar, and then he disposes of the body. But this isn't where Joe stops. He then goes to sniper both Ted and his son in their home and tries to sort of frame it in a way that it was Antifa who did all of this. What Joe doesn't know is that this also happens on the Pueblo tribes land, so now they get involved with their own police, and Joe's now on the run trying to cover his tracks so that they don't get to him. He thought that it was just going to be an Eddington thing and he could cover up the whole thing, become mayor, and everybody was going to be happy, right? Doesn't work that way. We have Officer Butterfly now sort of trying to find out what Joe did, as he's sort of suspicious of him, interrogating even his mother-in-law, Dawn. What ends up happening, however, is there is a shining moment for Joe to blame all of this on Micheal, because one of the young people in Eddington, Brian, who was a friend of Ted Garcia's son, actually sent a picture to Micheal of the friend Eric kissing on a young girl named Sarah, who was sort of like Michael's ex, I believe, or they had a thing or almost had a thing. We don't really get the question answered here, but now Brian believes that it was probably Micheal who shot Ted and Eric because he got jealous. And for Joe, lightning hits right here, because now he can blame it on Micheal. He plants a gun in his car. He plants Ted Garcia's like stopwatch in his car as well. So now everything points to Micheal, and Guy, who is a guy who was sort of like always keeping an eye on Micheal, because seemingly you can imply there was a little bit of racism that Guy had towards Micheal. He's just 100% on board with Joe trying to take Micheal in for the murder of Ted Garcia. Now, before all of this can be solved or anything, we see that there are some actors or extremists, whatever you want to call them, that sort of take on the role of being like a fake Antifa or whatever you want to call it, that are just here to sow chaos in Eddington, burning dumpsters, eventually freeing Micheal and using him as bait to get Guy and Joe into the desert, where they eventually are trying to get Micheal back, but there are landmines everywhere, so when Guy steps on one, he is completely blown to pieces. Micheal gets severely hurt but doesn't die. Also, Joe gets just blown back, and then he is being hunted by these people that have come now to create chaos in Eddington. He eventually gets a huge machine gun that he starts using to defend himself, but in the process ends up killing Butterfly, and then he is stabbed straight in the head by one of these people. And just as Joe is about to get killed, however, Brian comes through with a handgun and completely shoots the guy down while he live streams it, and thus Brian becomes a conservative hero influencer and capitalizes on all of this. Joe survives the attack but now is paralyzed, cannot even speak, but he has become the mayor, so Dawn becomes the mouthpiece for Joe and uses her influence to sort of bring in whatever is going to benefit her the most and give her more power in all of this, which includes letting this data center establish itself in Eddington. Even though it's going to be bad for the people, the environment, and everything, she's still going to do this because it's just going to benefit her own self. That same day, we see that Micheal survives the attack, and now he lives in the outskirts of Eddington, it seems, and he's still practicing his shots and all of this. We don't know exactly why, but we see that Micheal just wants to get a look at Joe and see how far he's fallen down from the person he met beforehand, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. At the end of the movie, we see that now Louise is with Vernon, and she actually finally got pregnant, something she never wanted to do with Joe and something Joe wanted right from the beginning of the film. We see him watching videos on how to talk to your partner about wanting a baby, so it's a very sad moment for Joe, but Joe really dug his own grave here, as we see, and that's pretty much the ending of the film right there. Let's talk about the themes and everything that are presented throughout Eddington, because there is a lot of things that I do want to discuss here for sure. So our main story, our main conflict showcases Joe and Ted, who are on opposite sides of the political spectrum, you could say. They view different policies and things that happen, whether it's the mask mandates, social distancing, the pandemic, or guns and all of that. They are sort of divided by these things. And in the background, you have the data center, which is Solid Gold Magikarp, that is just trying to use the people here in their land for their own advantage, not caring what happens or the repercussions of what they're doing. Their final bottom line is the dollar. And we see that Ted is sort of moved by that, even though throughout the film we see that he kind of feels hesitant about it as well. What Aster's getting here is how a lot of our politicians, whether they're on one side or the other, they all sort of share one similar thing. A lot of them is that they are all pretty much moved by their donors or whoever it is, not really the people that vote them in or the people that they are sort of like representing. They're representing their donors at the end of the day. And I think that's a great thing to always acknowledge and to think about when it comes to politicians that sound like they're going to be this great new thing to some people, and of course to others it's not going to be the same thing, because there is a culture war, and that's something also Aster talks about in this film. And I'll get to the culture war in a bit, but I think at the end of the day what Aster's saying is we are hearing so many great things that this person's talking about and they're saying, but are they going to fulfill that? And what's the underlying thing that they're really trying to do with our votes and the power that we're going to give them to handle our taxpayer monies and things like that? What are they really going to do with it? They could say that they're here to fight for your freedom, that they're going to let you not wear a mask, that they're going to keep you safe, whatever it is. But at the end of the day, there's something deeper down there. This culture war that everybody's having is sort of ignoring the true class war that is out there, and that really is the biggest difference in our societies, in our world, is the different classes and systems that are in place to keep you on the same level. Big tech is a thing I think we are seeing more and more today with the data centers and the pollution that is happening, and the place that they live in is becoming more inhospitable just because these big tech companies and these larger billionaires and people with so much influence, power, and money are able to do whatever they want without being checked by our government, current, past, whatever you want to say. They all are letting these big tech players do whatever they want to do, and that in itself causes for water to be polluted, land to be inhospitable, and it's a big danger to a lot of us who are just trying to have a happy life, which I think is something that both sides can really agree on. At the end of the day, that's really what everybody wants, just a happy life with their family. But there are these people that want to manipulate the narrative. As we saw in Eddington, it's done through our phones that we are constantly glued on. There was always a moment somebody was on their phone during Eddington, and that caused more and more divide, of course. And I'm not saying that everybody is manipulative. Of course, there are people who are prejudiced or bigots at the end of the day, whether it was from the phone or not. They still are those people, but still, I think that the flame still gets stoked a little bit more when it comes to technology, whether it's just from your handheld or even your computer or what they're doing in those data centers, right? And I think what Aster also talks about here is the activism that we saw in the film. We see these people who clearly, I think for the most part, all of them do care about the human rights aspect of it and the injustice that we see in our society through the systems that have been built to oppress people for decades or hundreds of years. These systems have been in place in order to keep people down, in order to abuse and continue the cycle in which minorities or marginalized communities aren't able to sort of come out of. And I think another interesting character in the film is Micheal, played by Michael Ward, who is this black police officer who works for the sheriff, who is trying to sort of make changes through the system itself and sort of become a part of it as well. And he sees it in a way at the beginning, I feel, that he can grow into the system just as his father did and maybe make a difference, right? And we see throughout the film he is challenged throughout, from Sarah, who says he shouldn't be part of the police force because he knows what it's done, to Joe, who says, hey, you could eventually become deputy sheriff, things like that. And we see that Joe at some point, and also Guy, kind of becomes suspicious of Micheal wanting to go up into a higher position and kind of feel mad about it, or jealous, you could say, because they are okay with Micheal working with him and all of that. But once the idea comes in that Micheal will be above them or even higher up, then they eventually get weird about it and they're just like, I don't know. And that's why I think it's so easy for Joe to just slip in and make Micheal the enemy, because he wants to take Micheal out. And it's something that's deeply rooted in him, I think, of the system, because we don't think Micheal can really bring that change to the system that has been already established to oppress him and many others. And now he is trying to be a part of it and trying to make that change within. He's quickly taken out by one of the top guys, which is the sheriff, because why wouldn't Joe Cross maybe think about doing it towards Guy? It was easier to blame Micheal or to blame the protesters as he did in the beginning, because that's something that's sort of like subconscious for Joe. That's who, in his mind, he sees sort of like the easier target to take out. And it's definitely a lot more we could talk about with Joe and Michael's relationship that we saw at the beginning of the film was seemingly good. And when Joe was able to use Micheal for his own benefit, for his mayoral run, he was a lot more warmer to Micheal than he was towards the end when Micheal was scared and was being blamed for all of this, right? So I think it's an interesting aspect, right? And I think that a lot of people that were protesting in the film, their heart was in the right place, but at times we saw that ego got in front of them. And in turn, they sort of just start being performative. They want to do these things, whether it's to impress somebody, to feel better about themselves. And I think this performative aspect goes even deeper with Brian, who is trying to fit in, sort of impress the girl as well at the beginning, and follows these very, like you could say, quote unquote, textbook, like activism of sorts, not really diving deeper into the problems or trying to figure out how to solve them. But as soon as he sees an opportunity to revert and become a sort of hero for the other side, and that can gain him notoriety, that can gain him a sort of fame and whatever else comes with it, money, etc., popularity, which is mainly what it seems Brian's looking for, he just jumps straight through it. In like a blink of an eye, he was giving a speech about social injustice and all of this, and then in the next moment you see Brian, he's already like a sort of poster child for guns and for the conservative to be right, that Antifa, that people that are protesting are the ones that are the horrible ones and need to be taken care of by somebody like Brian. So you see Brian go through this flip-flop, just whatever is sort of circumstantial for him and will make him that much more popular or loved, you know? So I think that's something that we really see reflected in a lot of societies. People quickly jump on these bandwagons, don't really take the time and use their resources to help as they should. It's more of a status quo for them to be seen as the leader of that movement in a way, and hijack it from the people that are actually trying to do good and trying to find justice through these protests, activism, and all of that. And what we clearly see is things get lost in the sauce really quick, because at the end of the day, when the activism and all of that isn't really like working to do what they wanted to do, then they clearly shift or abandon it completely. And it's the memification of a lot of things we see today. We don't take a lot of these things seriously, because if we want real change, there's real ways to make that real change happen. And I'm not saying that activism, protesting, and all of that is bad or is something that we should completely abandon, because I think it's still important to have these people who are truly out there trying to make a change, voicing their opinions, talking about it. Because if it comes through the news cycle or any of that to somebody who's on the fence about things and they hear what exactly these people are doing, it can cause that change that starts to become like a snowball effect. But I think the real change truly starts at the dollars, at the base of the people who are running the show, right? The government. If the government's not really changing, you can protest and protest and protest, but nothing's really moving. It's just sort of, for a lot of people, a way to say, well, I was out there, where were you? You weren't out there, so you don't really care. But I think that sort of people who use it or do it in the wrong way sort of hurt the bigger and larger message, right? And that's something that I think we see also in Eddington, when they quickly try to change the protest to be just peaceful. And yes, peaceful protest and things like that is important, but also what really is going to drive a change, you know? And I think it all goes back to Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, if you've seen that movie, which I do want to talk about as well. I think one of the larger themes in Eddington as well definitely has to be conspiracy, paranoia, and hysteria in America. And it's not just an American thing, of course, but I can't speak on other places that I don't live in. But in America, we saw that these conspiracies started to really come to the surface in a way they never had before. Back in the day, even like 5 years prior to the pandemic or 10, these conspiracies, these theories would be things that you would sort of like stumble upon every now and then if you're on threads or forums and things like that. It wasn't really like, I would say, mainstream. It was sort of a niche. 2020 came a time when I think a lot of people were just like in lockdown and nobody really had much to do. Places were closed. There wasn't much, right? Except your internet, your phone, your computer, and you had time to sort of just be scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. So eventually these things just started to surface and come up, and people were nervous about what was happening. They had no clue. This uncertainty caused so many to just be like, I don't know what's the truth anymore. And we've been wired to think, well, if they have a good looking setup, they have a nice mic, they sound good, they're probably telling the truth. And it sort of comes out professional in a way, right? So you start to really believe that everything they say is the word of God. And we saw that throughout the years prior to the pandemic, the news, the major news places and all of that were sort of degraded to being fake news, or not really telling you the truth, or they're just trying to control you. Like, these tropes started to float around years and years before. So when the pandemic happened and nobody really had the answers, people turned to other places to get their information, to get their news. And it's just human nature to really listen to the ones that kind of fit your agenda already, or that make you feel better about what's going on. And thus it gave you a sense of control. You felt that you knew who created this virus, and now you knew what their end goal was. So you felt less scared about something that truly was just uncertain. And I think that's something we see in Eddington happen to characters, from Louise to Dawn, even at a certain point, Joe. I think we see these characters feel like they're losing control, and it scares them a lot that they are not in control of their narrative narrative of their life. So they latch on to anything that's going to help them have some self-control, which for Joe ended up being something that ended up costing him so much, from his wife to even his way of being able to be free and being able to move around, being used almost like a puppet by all those around him. He doesn't have the final say. He doesn't have any say at all. He's just a figure of sorts. And I think it's a lot what we see people feel about their elected officials, that they're just sort of there in the background. They're just the face and all, but behind them is the true people running the show. And I think Eddington at its core is a warning that if we don't get it together, if we don't try to move past these differences or sort of come to a reconciliation with each other. Yes, you can have differing opinions, and yes, people who are bigoted, racist, and who are just filled with so much prejudice should definitely be called out always. We don't need people that are going to want to hurt others just because they are a minority or from a marginalized community or all of that. We do need to call those people out always. Make that 100% clear. Always call out people who are racist and just trying to hurt a marginalized community member. But we also need to see who really is trying to hurt all of us, right? And I think that's what Eddington really at its core is. A film that sort of is looking at how we bicker and bicker about these things through our phones or through the computer, and eventually that just leads to the things happening because the people of Eddington were fighting each other, and in the background they were building this data center, and nobody was able to say, hey, I don't think that should be right there, and I don't want this polluting my water or destroying my land I live in. But it still happened, and it happened under Joe, who was the one that was calling out these things and trying to sort of set an example of how he would be better than Ted Garcia, ended up just being the same type of politician. So I don't know, it's an interesting movie, a lot to discuss. I've already gone over how much I wanted to talk about it in this video. We could talk more about it in another video if y'all want, but let me know. We'll see. If y'all are interested in, I'll definitely do it. But we got a lot of other movies to talk about as well. Together, Weapons, all coming out pretty soon. Very excited to talk more movies with y'all. I just love sort of dissecting and talking more about all of this. So stay tuned for more. I'll see all of you next time. Hit the subscribe button and notification bell. Let's get to 50,000 subscribers. Stay safe, stay positive.